Dawn broke over the red earth of Burkina Faso, but the morning was anything but ordinary. On the president's desk in Ouagadougou lay a single sheet of paper flown across continents from Washington. The words were short, the meaning brutal: 48 hours. Within that narrow window of time, the United States demanded control of 60% of Burkina Faso's gold and oil revenues. If the order was refused, the country would be cut from the dollar system that keeps global trade alive. Accounts frozen, contracts shredded, payments rejected, no negotiations, no appeals, just a deadline meant to bring a nation to its knees. But even as Washington's clock began to tick, another clock was set in motion in Africa's heart. Ibrahim Traoré, the soldier who became president, signed his own decree 72 hours. In that span, every gold mine, every oil license, every barrel of wealth buried in the soil would be placed under national law. Exports halted, convoys monitored, data rerouted to a new command center. No retreat, no delay, no compromise. For the first time in modern memory, a small African nation had answered an American ultimatum with one of its own. And so two clocks began to run, one in Washington, one in Ouagadougou. One counting down to financial paralysis, the other counting up to sovereignty enforced. For ordinary Burkinabe, the questions were immediate and painful. If the dollar disappears from our markets, who will pay for bread? If wages are frozen, how will miners survive? If fuel convoys are turned back, what will drivers pour into their tanks? Yet for the wider world, the question is even sharper. Can a landlocked nation of 25 million people make the United States blink first? Or are these two clocks simply ticking toward collapse? This is not theater. This is history igniting before our eyes. If your heart beats for Africa's freedom, if you believe that sovereignty is action, not permission, then stay with us. Subscribe, share this story, and stand with those who refuse to bow. The ultimatum arrived like a thunderclap. 48 hours, that was the timeline stamped onto the fate of Burkina Faso. The message from Washington was not written in the language of diplomacy, but in the blunt tone of command: surrender 60% of your gold and oil revenues, or face exclusion from the dollar system that underpins 90% of world trade. To many in the global financial capitals, this was simply a matter of enforcement, another nation reminded of its place. But for ordinary citizens in Ouagadougou, Bobo-Dioulasso, or the small farming towns scattered across the savannah, it was something far more terrifying. It meant that bread could vanish from the markets, wages could stop without warning, and fuel pumps could run dry overnight. The power of the dollar is invisible to most Americans, but for people living under its shadow, it is as heavy as chains. With one directive, Washington could freeze Burkina Faso's accounts abroad, block every international wire transfer, and cancel contracts that provided medicine, fertilizer, or tuition for students overseas. Remittances, those small lifelines sent home by Burkinabe working in Europe and America, amounting to more than $400 million a year, would be severed instantly. A farmer in Ouagadougou, already stretched thin, could find his fertilizer shipment canceled because it was priced in dollars. A hospital in Bobo-Dioulasso might discover its order of antibiotics and insulin returned with the word rejected. A school principal in Ouagadougou could wake up to find there were no funds left to pay teachers at the end of the month. This was not speculation. Analysts in Europe and the United States had seen the script before. The same methods had been applied against Iran, against Venezuela, against Russia. In every case, the US dollar was wielded not merely as currency, but as a political weapon. It was the bloodstream of the global economy, and to cut access to it was to strangle a nation. Yet there was something different about this moment. The ultimatum did not arrive in a vacuum. In the months leading up to it, Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traoré had already begun tightening its grip over natural resources. Gold, which accounted for more than 70% of the country's export revenue, was placed under stricter state oversight. Oil exploration projects were being renegotiated. Foreign mining licenses faced review, and some had already been revoked. At the same time, Ouagadougou was building closer ties with neighbors, Mali and Niger, strengthening a Sahel alliance that sought to reduce dependency on Western systems. To Washington, these moves looked like defiance. To the people of Burkina Faso, they looked like long overdue steps towards sovereignty. But whatever the perspective, the consequence was, the same pressure was now turned into an ultimatum. Markets across Ouagadougou fell silent when the news broke. Radio stations repeated the figure like a funeral bell: 48 hours. Street vendors whispered about what would happen if the dollar disappeared. Would the central bank still deliver wages? Would buses run if fuel convoys stopped at the borders? Families who depended on remittances from Paris or New York wondered how they would survive if that money never arrived. The tension was palpable. You could feel it in the crowded markets where women haggled over bags of rice, suddenly uncertain if they should stockpile what they could. You could hear it in the mechanical silence of truck depots where drivers stood idle, waiting for instructions that might never come. You could sense it in the anxious voices of doctors and teachers who asked the same question: if funding dries up, how long until our services collapse? And above it all hung the reality that this was no empty threat. Already, test transactions routed through New York were being slowed. Banks reported delays. International contractors called their Burkina Faso partners, warning of suspension of operations if payments could not be processed. It was the machinery of global finance shifting into gear, a quiet tightening of screws that would soon turn into full-scale suffocation. The symbolism was as sharp as the substance. Here was a landlocked nation of 25 million souls, one of the poorest in raw statistics, being told by the most powerful economy in the world that it had 48 hours to obey or collapse. The countdown was not abstract. It was visible on the faces of market traders, miners, and mothers feeding their children. Burkina Faso had faced hardships before: droughts, coups, insurgencies. But this was different. This was not the weather or war. This was an invisible weapon that struck at every transaction, every paycheck, every loaf of bread. It was the kind of pressure designed not just to break a government, but to break the will of a people. And yet, as the sun set on that first day of the ultimatum, something else began to stir. While Washington's clock ticked down from 48, a different kind of clock was set to tick up in Ouagadougou. It was not a countdown to collapse, but a countdown to defiance. The tension in Ouagadougou could be measured in hours. Every passing moment felt like a drumbeat toward collapse or toward something entirely new. Washington's ultimatum had set one clock ticking, but now the capital of Burkina Faso was living inside another clock, one signed by President Ibrahim Traoré himself. 72 hours to bring the nation's resources under full state control. Two clocks, two verdicts, two futures colliding. By the 12th hour, the consequences began to surface. Some foreign operators reluctantly signed the new compliance forms, agreeing to Burkina Faso's stricter controls. Others suspended operations, entirely unwilling to gamble on a system cut from the dollar. Convoys of trucks carrying ore were halted at roadside checkpoints until their paperwork matched the new national format. At mining compounds, servers storing production data were unplugged and rerouted to Ouagadougou's new command center. There were no speeches, no shouting, only orders issued and obeyed. At the 20th hour, the first signs of sabotage appeared. A fire broke out at a fuel depot on the outskirts of the capital. Fire brigades contained it quickly, but investigators discovered evidence of deliberate tampering. Within hours, two officials linked to foreign accounts were dismissed. The message was unmistakable: resistance would be crushed not only on the battlefield, but also within the bureaucracy. By the 30th hour, the tension had reached the streets. Competing narratives filled the airwaves. Foreign broadcasters announced that collapse was imminent. State radio countered with calm reassurances, insisting the transition was under control. Shopkeepers counted smaller piles of cash. Drivers waited at depots, tanks empty, wondering what tomorrow would bring. Fear was present, but so was something else: resolve. Then came the turning point. At the 32nd hour, test transfers routed through New York were blocked. The U.S. ultimatum shifted from paper to reality. Banks froze transactions. Salaries scheduled for delivery simply disappeared. For the first time, the pressure of the dollar blockade was no longer theoretical. It was machinery in motion. Inside the command center, the atmosphere hardened. President Traoré ordered contingency measures. Alternative settlement routes through Sahel banks were activated. Regional barter systems were opened. Gold-backed credits, primitive in the eyes of global financiers, were issued to pay miners and keep markets moving. The system was improvised, clumsy, but it provided oxygen while the main artery was closing. By the 45th hour, the pressure was acute. International headlines declared Burkina Faso cut off. Analysts predicted collapse within days. And yet on the ground, miners held in their hands their first pay slips printed in gold-backed notes. Grain trucks rerouted through Mali arrived at village markets. Fuel convoys escorted by soldiers began to unload at depots, crude in form but functional in practice. The decree was not only holding it, was breathing. At the 47th hour, as Washington's clock neared zero, another development arrived. The first deposit into Burkina Faso's New People's Resource Fund was processed directly from gold deliveries, bypassing blocked wire transfers. It was a small transaction in the global scale, but to Burkina Faso citizens, it was proof the system could bend without breaking. Still, the danger was far from over. At the 55th hour, another sabotage attempt was foiled. Two men, both with ties to foreign contractors, were arrested near a power substation. The arrests were broadcast nationwide. Applause broke out in courtyards and street corners. It was cautious, but it steadied public confidence. The people began to believe that their government was not simply resisting, it was fighting back. By the 60th hour, a new reality emerged. Western outlets continued to predict imminent collapse, but in Ouagadougou, the markets remained open. Miners still reported for duty. Convoys, though fewer, continued to roll under military escort. Fragile, strained, but functioning. Each hour beyond Washington's 48 became a victory of survival. And then at the 70th hour, history walked across the border. A convoy of trucks from Mali and Niger rumbled into Burkina Faso carrying grain fuel and medicine. The message could not be clearer. Burkina Faso was not alone. Cameras captured President Traoré standing shoulder to shoulder with his Sahel allies as the first trucks entered the capital. No speeches were necessary. The image itself rewrote the narrative. For the first time in living memory, a small West African nation had answered an American ultimatum not with retreat, but with reinforcement. What began as fear was turning into a fragile sense of pride. Citizens waved flags from rooftops. Villages organized patrols to guard depots. Engineers extended drone networks to watch over convoys. The nation was no longer just following a decree, it was enforcing it with its own hands. As the 72nd hour approached, the world held its breath. Two clocks had run their course. Washington's 48 had expired. Ouagadougou's 72 was still in motion. Collapse had not come. Instead, the confrontation had reached its climax. A nation expected to fall had refused to bow. The confrontation between Washington's 48 hours and Ouagadougou's 72 was never an abstract clash of documents. It was lived in the kitchens, clinics, classrooms, and markets of Burkina Faso. Every decision filtered down into daily survival, and every hour that passed carved new consequences into the fabric of society. In the markets of Ouagadougou, women who once bought rice by the sack now purchased it by the bowl. Prices rose overnight as traders struggled to gauge whether supplies would keep coming. Bread that had always been affordable suddenly carried a 10% increase. For families living hand-to-mouth, those small numbers meant skipped meals or children going to bed hungry. The ultimatum was no longer a headline, it was the sound of coins dropping thinner into the hands of mothers. For workers, the situation was equally precarious. Miners, accustomed to receiving wages in CFA francs, found their pay transformed into gold-backed credits. To outsiders, it looked primitive, a throwback to another era. But to the miners themselves, it meant dignity. "At least we are still working," one man was quoted as saying, holding his payslip with a mixture of disbelief and relief. In a country where unemployment and poverty had long been sources of despair, the mere continuation of wages, even in altered form, was proof that collapse had not yet arrived. Teachers and doctors, however, faced a harsher reality. With international transfers, frozen funds for public services dried up. Salaries were delayed. Hospitals reported dwindling stocks of antibiotics and insulin. Clinics sent word to families that if international shipments did not resume, essential medicines could vanish entirely. These were not distant scenarios, they were daily countdowns inside communities already stretched thin. And yet beneath the hardship, a subtle but profound political shift was underway. For decades, Burkina Faso citizens had lived under systems shaped abroad. Decisions about currency trade and even health budgets were often made not in Ouagadougou, but in Washington, Paris, or Brussels. Now, for the first time in living memory, the rules came directly from their own capital, even if those rules brought difficulty. Market traders remarked, "At least it is our decree, not theirs." That fragile sense of ownership became a form of resilience. On the political stage, the decree reshaped Burkina Faso's image overnight. In the eyes of many Africans, a country often dismissed as peripheral had stood its ground against the most powerful financial system in the world. Commentators across West Africa described the 72-hour decree as a symbolic inversion of power. For once, the ultimatum did not come from Washington alone. An African nation had set a deadline of its own. Regionally, the effects rippled outward. Mali and Niger, bound to Burkina Faso through the Sahel alliance, responded, not with silence, but with convoys of food, fuel, and medicine. Cameras showed their leaders standing with Traoré at the border, a tableau of solidarity that resonated across the continent. What had begun as a solitary standoff now appeared as the seed of a bloc willing to challenge external dictates. In cafes from Dakar to Accra, debates sprang up: could our nations survive such pressure? Should we prepare similar systems of resilience? The crisis in Ouagadougou had become a continental mirror. Internationally, reactions split. The African Union called for restraint, though without concrete action. European officials warned of instability, framing compliance as essential to global financial order. But among ordinary citizens across Africa, the perception was different. Burkina Faso had shown that submission was not the only option, even when the cost was high. Inside Burkina Faso, the confrontation turned neighbors into guardians. Villages organized patrols around depots. Engineers volunteered to expand drone surveillance of convoys. Ordinary people, once passive observers, became active participants in enforcing sovereignty. The decree was no longer only a government directive, it was a collective act of defiance. By the end of the 72 hours, the consequences were unmistakable. Prices had risen, supplies were strained, fear lingered, yet collapse had not arrived. More importantly, the political psychology of the nation had shifted. The ultimatum had been designed to break willpower, but instead it hardened it. Citizens who once doubted their ability to stand alone now whispered the same phrase in markets and courtyards: Africa bows to no one. The costs were real, but so was the transformation. What began as a financial siege had become a lesson in sovereignty, painful, fragile, but unforgettable. From Washington's vantage point, the ultimatum was meant to be decisive. For decades, the dollar has been the bedrock of international trade, its clearinghouses in New York serving as gatekeepers of the global economy. To cut Burkina Faso off was to deliver a lesson: small states could not defy the system without paying the price. American analysts framed it as a necessary enforcement of order, a message to other nations considering similar moves toward resource nationalism. Yet, what unfolded in Ouagadougou unsettled that narrative. Instead of immediate collapse, the 72-hour decree created improvised lifelines, gold-backed credits, Sahel convoys, and regional barter. Fragile, yes, but real. And for the first time in years, the dollar blockade was met not with surrender, but with adaptation. Even Western media, which predicted Burkina Faso's downfall at the 48th hour, had to adjust its headlines: Sahel Alliance challenges U.S. sanctions. Across Europe, officials warned that defiance would breed instability. Banks quietly monitored exposure, fearing contagion if other African states began to question the dollar's absolute hold. In Asia and Latin America, commentators saw something different: a precedent. If one of the world's poorest nations could endure 48 hours outside the system, perhaps others might one day attempt the same. Most striking was the reaction across Africa itself. Civil society groups debated openly whether dependence on foreign currencies had become a strategic liability. Radio programs in Ghana, Senegal, and Nigeria asked their audiences, could we survive if the dollar spigot was turned off? For many listeners, Burkina Faso's experiment was no longer just about gold and oil. It was about dignity. What Washington intended as a punishment may paradoxically have accelerated a conversation about sovereignty that stretches far beyond the Sahel. 72 hours have passed. Washington's 48-hour ultimatum has expired. The wires were cut, contracts suspended, salaries delayed. Yet Burkina Faso did not collapse. Instead, the decree from Ouagadougou became law enforced in real time by miners, drivers, traders, and villages who refused to bow. Fragile, improvised, imperfect, but functioning. This confrontation is not over. The financial blockade remains. Prices continue to rise. Hospitals and schools still face shortages. The system is strained to its limits. But the lesson of these hours is clear. Even under immense pressure, sovereignty is not an idea, it is action. A small nation once expected to fold has shown that survival is possible and that survival can inspire others. The warning for the world is sharp. If the dollar can be used as a weapon, then every country is vulnerable. And if even Burkina Faso can endure 48 hours outside its reach, then the global order itself may be shifting. Today it is gold and oil in Ouagadougou. Tomorrow it could be wheat in Cairo, copper in Santiago, or gas in Lagos. The question that echoes from these 72 hours is simple: who truly controls the future, those who impose deadlines or those who defy them? To you watching, I ask, if your country were given only 48 hours to choose between submission and sovereignty, what would you demand of your leaders? If your heart beats for Africa's freedom, please share this story so it will not fade. Subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines, and remember these words that carried across the markets of Burkina Faso as the clocks struck their final hour: Africa bows to no one.